This podcast is presented by SCHOTT. With over 130 years of experience delivering innovative, high-quality products, SCHOTT is the global leader in specialty glass, glass ceramics, and other innovative materials. With a direct presence in over 30 countries, the company is a highly skilled partner for several high-tech industries, including defense, semiconductors, data communications, optics, energy, automotive, aerospace, and healthcare. One of SCHOTT's key goals is environmental protection corporate-wide, and it is committed to being the first specialty glass manufacturer in the world to be climate neutral by 2030. Thank you again to our sponsors at SCHOTT for helping us present this podcast to you. Welcome to Emerging Tech Horizons. I'm Dr. Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technology Institute. And with me on today's segment is Dean Cheng. Dean is currently a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, with whom ETI has partnered on a number of activities. Dean specializes in the U.S. relationship with China. Prior to joining the Potomac Institute, he had been a senior research fellow for Chinese political and military affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Among his many skills, he is fluent in Chinese, uses Chinese language materials regularly in his work. Previous to that, Dean worked with the China Studies Division, previously Project Asia, at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is a federally funded research and development center in FFRDC. And there he specialized in Chinese military issues with a focus on Chinese military doctrine and especially Chinese space capabilities. And before that, he worked for Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, as an analyst with the U.S. Congress's Office of Technology Assessment in the International Security and Space Division. Dean's published work is extensive, but it includes the volume Cyber Dragon, Inside China's Information Warfare and Cyber Operations, published in 2016 by Prager. He has testified before Congress, spoken at the National Space Symposium, U.S. National Defense University, U.S. Stratcom Deterrence Symposium, Harvard, MIT. He's appeared frequently in print and broadcast media to discuss Chinese space and military activities. And let me just say that in Washington, D.C., there is no more respected expert on China, and especially how China thinks about problems, than Dean Cheng. So it's been a privilege to know Dean for many years, and I've been involved in many activities where we have relied on his expertise. So, Dean, thank you so much for joining us in this segment. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and in particular for that introduction. I'm not sure that I'm going to quite live up to that, but I'll do my best.
Oh, I have no doubt. So Dean, I filled the audience in a little bit about your background, but could you tell us a bit more? How did you get to your current position, and especially what is your current focus?
Well, that is a long and winding trail there, but suffice to say that through a variety of circumstances, I wound up being able to come to Washington, D.C. and actually do what I wanted to do since high school. I was a weird kid, which is to study defense and technology.
Many of us were, by the way.
To try and contribute to a better understanding of how defense and technology work, particularly with regards to key states like China. My parents emigrated here, and they basically wanted to make sure that their children did not forget their culture. So I grew up in a bilingual, which when you're 8 years old is pretty miserable, having to learn how to read and write Chinese. But a little further along, it turns out to be quite useful. And that's, I guess, maybe one of the most important things to just sort of recognize is the extent to which China does publish and does talk about its own capabilities, its own intentions, its own status, but it's all in Chinese. And not surprisingly, they don't feel it necessary to translate that for a foreign audience. But you can get certain insights into what they themselves value and what they themselves are thinking about.
And I assume it's safe to say that what of the little material that they publish in English, it's quite different than what they actually publish for their own consumption in Chinese.
So yes, but for a couple of different reasons. So some of the stuff is published to influence us. So white papers and things, but we do need to recognize that even their translated white papers do reflect a bureaucratic convergence. Everybody had to sign off. A lot of it is an issue of omission. They simply don't translate it. And some of it is simply for money making. It's not even to propagandize. It's, hey, if there's an appetite internationally for Chinese views on Sun Tzu, right? Not classified, then we'll churn out lots of books. We'll all make money off it, and everybody will be happy. But for more internal discussions of things like military doctrine, technology plans, things like that, they don't tend to translate all of it. Although even now and then, even they do publish things like, for example, their space white paper comes out every 5 years, tied to the 5-year economic plans. What is in there tells you what their official civilian space program is going to be trying to achieve. If you solely rely on their space white paper, you'd almost think China has no military space program at all.
Interesting. So if I could focus on defense, so certainly over the past decade, there's been a growing acknowledgement of the reality of a strategic competition between the United States and China. China was characterized in the 2018 National Defense Strategy as a strategic competitor using predatory economics, that phrase, to intimidate its neighbors while militarizing features in the South China Sea. The 2022 National Defense Strategy kind of followed that up, stated the most comprehensive and serious challenge to U.S. national security is the PRC's coercive and increasingly aggressive endeavor to refashion the Indo-Pacific region and the international system to suit its interests and authoritarian preferences. And I can tell you from firsthand experiences, in my time most recently in the Pentagon, we started almost every morning by asking the question, what is China doing? It was our pacing threat. We looked across the board at the emerging technology. So I'm wondering, given that, can you discuss the role that emerging technologies, things like hypersonics, near and dear to my heart, directed energy, artificial intelligence, what role are they playing and will play in this strategic competition with this peer competitor?
So when we look at China as a strategic competitor, and as important when China looks outward at other states as its strategic competitors, it's important to recognize what they term comprehensive national power. Comprehensive national power basically is a term for all of the elements of national capability that feed into a nation's status. How do you compare a Brazil, a United States, a China, a Japan? And the answer is you can't just look at their military, although military power is important. You can't just look at their economy, although the economy is important. You also have to look at, for example, political unity. Does the country operate in a politically unified kind of way? From the Chinese perspective, they do, because the Chinese Communist Party is entirely in charge. The Americans are very strange because they have this incredibly messy democratic system that goes charging down rabbit holes and the like. So from their perspective, that's actually a weakness. Diplomatic respect. Other countries care what you think. Science and technology. And science and technology is vital because you don't simply want to make other people's t-shirts or washing machines or even computers. You want to set the terms of the technological competition. And so from the Chinese perspective, advanced technology is across an array of things, everything from mapping the human genome to improving crop output to chips, microchip manufacturing, to hypersonics. All of that is part of that broader S&T base that is the foundation, alongside the economy, of how China is competing with the United States, with Japan, with India, etc. Fall behind, and you are playing catch up all the time. Ideally, you set the terms. You become the leader in hypersonics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and now it's other people dancing to your tune.
We've certainly seen that, for example, in developing 5G standards. It seems that China has understood they need to step up, and frankly, I think they learned lessons from us very well. I'd love to go back, explore that idea of setting, essentially becoming a world leader in a technology area. Something I've noticed in the area that I know best, in hypersonics, is there seems to be this paradox that on the one hand, China has made huge investments. They obviously have programs that they don't talk about. At the same time, there's a strong desire to publish in U.S. journals, to come to U.S. conferences, to show off their wares. China built a hypersonic shock tube a number of years ago, and then very proudly came to a U.S. Unclassified conference where they presented all the details of how their shock tube worked. What the flow properties were, what their test times were. It struck me as intriguing that they seem to be also trying to establish a certain national prestige. Am I right about that, or am I completely off base?
No, you're absolutely right. It's important to recognize that China, for thousands of years, dominated Asia, was, in a sense, was for the time the leading economic power. We're talking about, say, in the 1400s or the 1200s, and then fell. Right, the so-called Center of Humiliation, 1842 to 1949. China goes from being a leader in so many different ways to being what was then known as the sick man of Asia, exploited by outside powers, and has been since 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China, been trying to work its way back up to the leading ranks. And again, leading ranks in what ways? Sure, it has the world's largest military. Yes, it has the largest population. But in what really matters are things like science and technology. And so, absolutely, they come to international conferences, whether it's on hypersonics, or on space, or on genetics, to very proudly display, look at what we can do. This is partly regime support. All this is only possible because of the Chinese Communist Party. All that we have because thanks to Mao and Deng and now Xi Jinping. But part of it is a genuine national pride. We were once the sick man of Asia. Now we are the first Asian country to land on the moon, to land on Mars, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I have to tip my hat. Some of their accomplishments have been truly impressive. Some of their space accomplishments have been truly impressive, especially the compressed timelines through which they've managed to produce such dramatic effects. So I'd ask you, given your background, can you tell our listeners, our viewers, how the Chinese Communist Party leadership views emerging technologies in their military applications? How do they fit into the larger context of strategic planning for the PRC?
So, emerging technologies, especially in the information communications technology realm, are vital. From the CCP's perspective, we have transitioned from the industrial age, where what really mattered was stuff. How many tons of bauxite did you smelt this year? How many merchant ships did you produce? How many steel I-beams did you produce? To information being the new currency of power, both domestically and internationally. Now, it's not just information bits and bytes. It's not just information data. It's all of the associated technologies, the hardware, the transmission technologies. You mentioned 5G earlier. And with that then comes artificial intelligence, quantum computing. With that also ideally would come things like room temperature superconductors and all of the associated power requirements and the like. If you can dominate that, several things happen. One, your military will now operate at the speed of thought, so to speak. Your forces will be able to react faster, will be able to seize the initiative. Your sensors will be able to provide your commanders with a better situational awareness. And in addition to pure military aspects, though, you have this broader strategic impact. If you are the key in the supply chain, if everyone has to come to you for things, then they may not be willing to challenge you to begin with. In which case, China, have succeeded because your very economic and technological prowess, you setting the standards, makes other people unwilling to challenge you at all. This is why Taiwan is an issue. Taiwan, not China, is the largest producer of the most sophisticated microchips that power your computer, your cell phone, etc.
Right, TSMC, yes.
Yep, right. So if China controlled TSMC, if China took the island tomorrow and just swallowed up everything, now we would all literally have to turn to China for our future phones, computers, and the like. Instead, because Taiwan does have TSMC, the United States sees the defense of Taiwan as it's in its own strategic interest. European countries and others have said, so maybe we have to care about the fate of this little island of just 23 million people. That is an example of how technology and especially emerging technologies, has a strategic impact, not just in terms of force on force, but strategic implication.
So I remember in 2016, I had the privilege of chairing a study through the National Academies on defending against hypersonic weapons, and you came and spoke to the panel. And at the time, I remember I thought you had one of the most insightful comments, which was that China would use, in this case, hypersonics, not just to scare the United States from, acting, say, against, but also to convince our allies in the region that we would not come to their defense. Is that still a valid?
Absolutely, and now it's not just hypersonics. When I spoke before your committee, at that time, anti-ship ballistic missiles were still. We talked about it. They had been theoretically described, but the Chinese hadn't yet fielded them in any meaningful numbers. Now, if you take a look at the annual DoD report on China, it says, oh no, they have them in regimental levels, so they're going to be able to salvo these things. And it's the same idea, in the sense of here we have an array of different weapons that will hold different parts of the American military at risk. Is the commander of Indo-PACOM, is the president going to be willing to sail into the teeth of a massive barrage of these types of weapons? The hypersonic test, which honestly should scare us. That hypersonic test saw the Chinese put a vehicle into orbit. The implication of that is that any Chinese satellite could, in theory, be carrying or be a mask for a hypersonic coming from orbit. There's a reason we and the Soviets banned fractional orbital bombardment systems. It was so destabilizing. And here are the Chinese doing this. So they have this array of systems now that is the US going to intervene. And if you are Japan or you are South Korea or you are any of our other allies, absolutely, you are going to be asking yourself, is Washington prepared to suffer major losses? And if they aren't, do I want to be the one left holding the bag saying, oh, Washington, we're on your side. Oops, where'd they go? And now facing a very angry China.
Yeah, exactly. You just touched on another point, and again, something that we spend time with our team in the Pentagon worrying a lot about, which is the ethical limits that China would or frankly would not impose on the use of some of the technology. I mean, the United States, we spent a lot of time thinking through the ethical uses of artificial intelligence. Biotechnology opens up a whole realm of applications that frankly have red lines that we in the United States wouldn't, and our allies wouldn't cross. We often speculated that the Chinese would be more likely to cross some of those lines. Is that a fair supposition, or are we?
I think we need to be very careful here. On the one hand, we should not assume that the Chinese are some kind of Fu Manchu monsters who will do whatever it takes to win. And if there are mutants and zombies that result, well, that's just the price. But that being said, certainly the CCP has very different limits on, for example, the right to privacy. And that has then implications for artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence depends on massive amounts of data for programming. And the Chinese have made very clear they have 1.3 billion people's worth of data. Everything from their bank accounts to their medical records to their taxi and takeout order history that they can plug in. What's really disturbing, though, is that it was in China that we had an example of a doctor engage in genetic manipulation of the human genome and brought it to term. And that doctor isn't sitting in jail. So you have to wonder, what are some of the ethical red lines within the Chinese system? And another one is the issue of COVID. Now, where COVID came from, I don't know. But what I think is very clear is that when COVID emerged in China, the CCP authorities did not inform the WHO, and other countries did not take every step possible to quarantine their own population. And that is, again, an ethical issue as well as a strategic issue.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I mean, often how many how many more millions of people died just because of their lack of transparency when COVID was first being identified. Maybe the instinct to cover up. So with that being said, that COVID has shown us many things. First, how interrelated the world is, but also we realize how interconnected our various supply chains are. We know how reliant the U.S. supply chains are on China. And given how connected the U.S. and Chinese economies are, can you talk a little bit about that subject? Where the Chinese supply chains are reliant on the U.S., where U.S. is reliant on China, and what the implications are for defense?
So the Chinese, in part, here we see some interesting choices again, have a dominant position, for example, in rare earths. Now, as you know, rare earths is something of a misnomer. They're not actually rare in terms of as a percentage of minerals, but they are very dirty. Processing them, getting them, both mining them and then processing them, produces lots of nasty side materials and waste. And the Chinese are willing to do both, to mine and to process, due to, frankly, lower environmental standards. So they have established a dominant position in what is not necessarily a rare mineral, but in terms of the processing, they're the only ones who are willing to pay the environmental price. That gives them a huge advantage then downstream in terms of anything that uses rare earths, everything from cell phones to fighter jets to cars. So that's a very interesting way of achieving dominance. It wasn't that they were necessarily smarter, it was just we're willing to pay that price. In other areas, however, of innovation, software is a good example. What we don't see is much in the way of Chinese innovation, at least from what we can tell publicly. Chinese computers still operate on foreign operating systems. And in fact, the story goes that they actually had Microsoft retain Windows 7 for something like 3 additional years, simply because it was going to take them that long to try and get all of their computers to transition off of Windows 7. We see this also with Huawei. Their phones relied on Android systems, and when the US basically said, nope, you can't have access to the Android store anymore, those Huawei phones pretty much died out globally, because without an operating system, they're a very nice paperweight. And the Chinese app stores were limited in number of apps, and quality control and security were quite poor. So that's where they are dependent on us in terms of supply chain. So I think a net assessment here would say that when it comes to commodities, the Chinese often can establish a better position. The little bottles for vaccines, as opposed to the vaccines themselves for COVID, all come from China. But when it comes to the higher end, more specialized items, there the grade is much more mixed. The West still has advantages, but the Chinese, because of the CCP's domination of the system, is better able to leverage its advantages than we are in the West.
And to be fair, they seem to have made significant strides in a few areas. Aerospace is, for one. They're actually building quite reasonable airplanes. We know they've invested a lot in aircraft propulsion, where before they couldn't build an engine to save themselves, but now China is investing very heavily in that. So they seem to be moving quickly.
Yes, and there are key technology areas, and you've identified several right there. Commercial aircraft, Boeing and Airbus better watch out, because the Chinese clearly have them in their sights. Jet engines, both for combat aircraft, but also for commercial airliners. Space systems across the board. They dominate space exports, parts of the space export market, because they, in a sense, pioneer turnkey exports. I will sell you not just a satellite that I will build for you and design for you, but I'll also train your ground crews. I will build a ground station. I will ensure the launch. All of that for one low price, which very few foreign companies can even think about competing with.
I remember in the mid 2000s doing a trip to Brazil, and they were collaborating very closely with China in space and visiting one facility, and there was about 30 on the construction floor of satellite facility, about 30 Brazilian engineers, about 30 Chinese engineers, and exactly as you say, it was not just delivering the satellite; it was working hand in glove with their engineers, teaching them how to do it. And the irony was, in some cases, they were using U.S. test equipment. When I asked my Brazilian host, I said, "So, do you learn Chinese or do they learn Portuguese?" And he looked at me with a puzzled look and said, "No, we all speak English." So it was very interesting window on and how they seem to be using soft power to build those diplomatic relations. It struck me on that visit that I was actually on a third floor balcony looking down on the floor. I was not,
Mm-hmm.
so the Chinese have clearly seen how to leverage technology to build a relationship. So if I could, I want to, at the beginning of the segment, I mentioned that you wrote a book entitled Cyber Dragon, Inside China's Information Warfare and Cyber Operations. In that book, you place Chinese cyber operations into sort of a larger context of how China thinks about information or informationization, I think you as you describe it in the book. Can you share a little bit more on that with our listeners? And are there any changes or developments since you wrote the book in, I think, 2015, 2016?
So that the book, when it was written, was reflecting the state of where the Chinese were, which is increasing informationization, not just of the military, but the entire nation and economy. So you had already the social credit score system, which really is all about using information for societal control. You had put in place the Great Firewall of China, which is a really fascinating example of artificial intelligence, because it can reach all the way into the individual packets of emails and websites and edit and censor at that level. It's not just saying, oh, it's a web page that says Mao Zedong is terrible, we'll ban that. Or the URL says Mao Zedong is terrible, we'll ban that. It's that, oh, it's a website that supposedly is about Kung Pao chicken recipes, but there's an entire paragraph in there about why Mao Zedong is terrible. The AI can identify that and either ban it or potentially edit out the paragraph. So you get your Kung Pao chicken recipe, but you don't have the criticism. Since then, we've watched the Chinese now talk about something called intelligenceization, which is a very awkward translation. But it's about the next step forward. So it's not just artificial intelligence, which is what I think most people default to, but the idea of a combination of AI, machine learning, set algorithms that will basically allow decision-making to be more automated for routine things, like, again, censoring of certain key phrases of certain websites, etc., but also recognizing that there's even more information out there. And how it can all come together becomes ever more complex. And because it's moving in many ways beyond the speed of human capacity, that it's a man-machine combined. And I'm not talking about cyborgs and things. I'm talking about sort of people and programs together achieving more of what the CCP wants, whether it's censorship, whether it's faster decision-making, whether it's being better analysis, because you can then handle the terabytes of data that are flowing around. So that's a significant advance, because the Chinese leadership is saying information as a whole is vital. Information you can't analyze is useless. So let's use all of this information revolution to speed up that absorption and analysis process.
Are there lessons there that we, the United States, should be learning, do you think?
I think recognizing how important information is one part. I think that one of our huge advantages that we sometimes forget is, as a free society, we have freer flow of information, and that the free flow of information is incredibly messy, but it is also its own self-correcting mechanism. How do you know something is wrong? Somebody tells you it's wrong. Well, how do they know unless they've had a chance to see your research and analysis? So I do think that our efforts, it seems that in many ways, all parts of our political spectrum seem to be intent more on controlling information rather than facilitating the flow. And I fear that that is going to wind up putting us at a disadvantage, not because the Chinese were smarter than we were, but because we were less confident in our own strengths than we should have been.
No, that absolutely resonates. Obviously there's a balance between security, not doing dumb things, not giving away harm, but also not shooting ourselves in the foot. And I agree with you. I've seen examples where, as I say, well-meaning patriotic Americans want to clamp down, limit exchange, and certainly in the scientific community,
Mm-hmm.
that can definitely have a dampening effect on our own research, our own innovation, our own fact checking. I always laugh. I usually get my best research ideas by sitting in a room at a conference and listening to other people and figuring out what they've done right or sometimes what they've done wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if we stop that, if we clamp down on that, then we ultimately wind up, I would say, falling right into a trap that may have been, set for us, or a trap of most of our own making.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So Dean, that's all the time we have for this segment. But it has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and actually, I'm going to ask if we can get you back for more, maybe a follow-on conversation, because I could talk to you forever on this topic. It is such a critical issue, and again, thank you for all your contributions in this area. Thank you for your thought leadership, all that you've contributed to this discussion and our understanding of this competition. There's no other way to describe it. This competition that we find ourselves in this time. So, Dean, thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'd be delighted to come back.
Sounds good. Thank you.